Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet in our new Q&A session, answering the questions we get from you, our readers and listeners. To ask a question, just hit us up on social media or shoot us an email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. John, this week I want to start us off with a question that's, I think, critical of the pro-life position here. And this comes from someone who does identify as a Christian, but seems to have a question that often gets asked of pro-lifers in a challenge to our position here, into the consistency of our position on the unborn, especially as it relates to Christian theology. So I'll just read this. This listener asks, if abortion is so evil, then why does God abort millions of fertilized eggs every day, week? With you folks, almost everything is black and white, no nuance. If a fetus has deformities to prevent it from living beyond a few hours after birth, then why put the mother through this trauma?
Yeah, this is why I think it's so helpful to start at the right place whenever we talk about abortion. I'm really excited, by the way. Our September short course is coming up, and given the recent decision in the June Medical Services in Louisiana and the kind of the ongoing upheaval state by state by state, when it comes to abortion law and trying to regulate, at least at some level, this practice, which has gone, for political reasons, largely unregulated in many places. The need for every single Christian to be able to answer questions like this, the need for every single Christian to make a case for life. This is, and so we're going to do a 4-week short course on, how to actually become a pro-life champion and make the point. And one of the main points is to start with the right question. I love my friend Greg Kokel puts it this way. He says, if your son came up behind you, and by the way, I have a 3-year-old boy, so I'm sure this is going to happen quite soon. It's almost happened, already. But he comes up behind you and says, hey, mom, hey, dad, can I kill this? Your next most important question is, well, what is it, right? If it's a cockroach, have at it. If they're holding the little brother by the neck, then we need to have counseling, right? It's, in other words, before we know what to do, we need to know what it is that we are talking about.
And there are quite a few creatures in between those two that we're going to have some questions about.
Yeah, we'll just leave cats alone, at this point. And that fundamental question, what is it, is really important. Our questioner is actually asking about two things. And by the way, week 3 of our short course is how to answer pro-abortion objections. And this is one of them. Well, why does God abort millions of fertilized eggs every day and week? Well, one could, if we're talking about a human life, right, which, by the way, embryology tells us that we are. Ultrasounds make us all think that we are talking. And if you ever talk to a woman who's pregnant and wants to be, or a couple who has struggled with infertility, they're going to consider this fetus their child. They're going to consider even the initial announcement of pregnancy, the fact that they now have a human life growing within them. So if it is a human life, then we've got to apply the same sort of rules. For example, what if we said, well, since millions of people die every day, why are we so against murder?
Yeah.
How is it any different, right? In other words, and we would say, well, the difference between millions of people dying every day and murder is the intent. It is wrong for someone to intentionally take an innocent human life. When we're talking about a fertilized egg, that's actually what we're talking about. You are what you were, Shane, at your very smallest was a fertilized egg. You were never a sperm. You were never an egg. But somehow, magically, spiritually, something beyond what we can actually understand to some degree when it comes to, reproductive science and embryology. When a sperm and an egg join, something new is created. It's no longer a sperm. It's no longer an egg. A sperm is a sperm, an egg is an egg. But when a sperm and an egg join, we call it a fertilized egg or a zygote. But actually what it is a human being at its very, very earliest stage. So if it is, then there is a categorical difference between intentionally taking the life of a innocent human being and it happening by natural causes. Now the question then is, well, why does God let millions of people die every day? We can actually have that conversation because of sickness and disease. That's the problem of evil, which is one that, continually comes up. But it's a categorical mistake, just like it is to talk about the fact that if millions of people die every day, then it shouldn't be wrong to kill someone. Intentionally taking a life is a different thing than a life actually being taken. The second question, and that's often, by the way, what happens when people argue for abortion, is they rattle off a bunch of exceptions, and you've got to stop and go, well, wait a minute, let's deal with this exception, let's deal with this exception, let's deal with this exception. So there's two questions here. There's not one question. There's one question and then an accusation that we're too black and white. The second question is, if a fetus has deformities to present it living beyond a few hours after birth, why put the mother through this trauma? One of the things I like to do at a time like this is go, okay, I'll give you those, but can you give me all the rest when there's not a deformity? Now, by the way, I don't think you should intentionally take the life of an unborn child because of deformity. In fact, she even limits it to a deformity that will prevent it from living a few hours after birth, right? Right now in America, nearly 70% of children that are diagnosed with the deformity that will not lead to its death, that's just Down syndrome, are now put to death. Can we have those lives back?
So what you're saying is this is a wedge question. It's the sort of question that's used to prove a point, but not really to actually defend the position. It's almost like the Mott and Bailey argument, where you have your nice picturesque motte. Is that right? And that's the external part of the castle. But then when someone attacks it, you retreat back to the Bailey is the external part. The motte is the castle. You retreat back to your fortress of what about this and this cases,
right? Yeah,
really,
I mean, you could call it also. Yeah, you could call it a red herring. I mean, what about in the cases of rape and incest? Okay,
sure.
Well, what about the 98% of the rest of cases in which abortions are committed that have nothing to do with rape and incest? Let's talk. In other words, to throw out a rare exception in which the fetus has a deformity to prevent it living beyond a few hours after birth, then give me all the, girl makes a bad decision sleeping with her boyfriend and has a chemical abortion, or a woman learns that her husband's not happy, or is not happy about it, or they want to control their reproduction because financially they're not in a place that they want to be, or in other words, what about all the other cases? This is a rare case that has nothing to do with not only the majority of abortions, but the vast majority of abortions. And from that, I'll say, okay, let's get to what you're really after, because you're not really after protecting any child with significant deformity that would cause it to die a few hours after birth. You want actually women to be able to choose which children they have. What about the sex-selective abortion, which is an enormous amount of abortions that take place in America?
Yeah, healthy girl whose only crime is being a girl.
Yeah, what about
going to kill her? You can't do it on the premises that you just advanced with, or that the skeptic, the hypothetical skeptic we're talking about here, or pro-choicer advances that
right.
The fetus is deformed. Well, okay, we'll give you that hypothetically. We'll give you that as a for the sake of discussion. Let's talk about the real reason here, because there's something behind that you're advancing. You're advancing a claim that a woman really has a right to choose for any reason, but the vast majority of abortions are not for the exceptional case that you just offered.
And then let's do the same thing that we did with the former question, which is ask the question, what is it that we're talking about? What is this that we're saying? Is it okay to kill? If there's no qualitative difference, and that's week 1, by the way, of our short course, between the embryo you once were and the human being that you are now, except for a few factors, which we'll teach that acronym. Then we can also say, well, listen, what if someone gets diagnosed with a terminal disease and they're going to actually suffer and die? And not only that, not only are they going to suffer, but their family is going to suffer because of this. And they've got, 4 weeks to live to walk through this sort of physical and mental anguish and the ongoing anguish. So then can I kill them? And by the way, does the taking of that life remove the anguish of the loss somehow?
Right.
You see what I mean? And it's just a category mistake that's being made, assuming up front the fundamental question which is at stake, which is that there's something different about the unborn or the preborn human than the born human, and that's a mistake.
And if you want to map those two scenarios precisely with each other, then you'd have to take the life of the person who's diagnosed with a miserable terminal illness without their consent, just like you do with the unborn child. This isn't like a doctor-assisted suicide scenario. What we're talking about here is euthanasia. It's a mercy killing, as people would call it, and that would be the case with abortion in these scenarios.
That consent point is a really important one because, again, like almost at every stage of what we're doing with sexuality, which abortion is a part of that larger conversation of having sexual freedom without sort of consequence, then if the unborn child is indeed a human being, independent, in the same sense. And of course, some people would say, well, no, they're dependent on their mother. It's like, yes, so are husbands dependent on their wives, like, and toddlers dependent on their mother. In other words, all of these things are category mistakes. And what you just said was extremely important. One of the things that makes this worse is the children have no say in it. This human being has no say in choosing not to allow someone else to, quote unquote, suffer mental anguish.
Yeah, let me add
Now,
one more thing, but go
sure.
ahead, John.
Well, I
going
was
to
just going to say this is so important for what I was going to say is this is why this short course is so important, because you shouldn't be stumped by these sorts of questions. You should be able to parse through them. You should be able to say, well, wait a minute, what is it that we're talking about? Identify the category mistake, identify the exceptions, the red herring approach. Like what about rape? And okay, I'll give you those. When we talk about abortion, 98% of our conversation are about children that do not fall into that category. What about them?
Yeah, I would say back to the theodicy point here, which is the question about why, if God does this, is it not okay for us to do it? We can ask the big questions about, how evil and suffering came into the world. The answer biblically, by the way, is human sin. It's that the world was not meant to be like this, and we made it like this through our sin and the shrugging off of God's sustaining power. But let's step aside from that question and move to the question that was actually asked, which is, if God does this, why can't we? And I think the answer is pretty clear. We're not God. God has prerogatives over life as the creator of life. And however you believe that he, through his permissive will, allows these sorts of grievous things to happen, he is not us. The reason that murder is wrong, John, it primarily is because it usurps God's prerogative over life. It's not because the taking of life intrinsically is wrong, because God does that a number of times throughout Scripture and on a large scale, in fact. It's because God alone has that right, and we don't have that right as human beings to take other lives, except where it's delegated, as in the power of the sword in Romans, as Paul speaks of it. So that's a non sequitur, that because God allows the death of children in utero, therefore we should be able to do the same thing. Again, if you extend that logic to children dying of starvation or something, well, if God allows all that sort of thing to happen, then why can't we just kill inconvenient children? That doesn't follow at all, and why should it?
Yeah. Well, and let's just be clear, to the atheist who says you're playing by different rules, I'm just going to say you have the same problem, right? In other words, nobody gets out of this problem. It's like the problem of evil, and said, well, this proves God doesn't exist. Okay, well, how do you explain evil if you don't believe in God? Right. Or how do you explain evil if you're a Hindu or if you're an Oprahist or whatever? Everybody has to actually explain the world as it actually is. And the world as it actually is involves, children who die in utero. Well, the atheist has an additional problem because there's not a moral framework to keep us from doing it, right? In other words, in an atheist framework, that should actually justify the killing of children later on, right? In other words, if this is the laws of nature and I am just nothing but a natural cause or process, and there's no moral framework that I am allegiant to or responsible to or governed by whatsoever, then actually Hitler was right when he was at least trying to off the weak. The eugenicists were right when they were essentially trying to play the rules of nature red in tooth and claw and the survival of the fittest, and actually start breeding that in to the way society is run. So no one gets out of this pickle, right? In terms of, what does this say about this? In fact, I think the atheist has the bigger problem.
Yeah, and honest materialists have always recognized this problem, going all the way back to Darwin.
Right.
It's said that if my theory is true, then I confess I've got this great conundrum, because preserving the lives of the innocent and the weak and the deformed and so forth, as he said, my moral intuition tells me to do this. Nonetheless, I can see, according to my theory, how it would be very injurious to the race of man. And so he recognizes very early on the materialist conundrum there. And I think every honest materialist has to recognize that they need to first explain why they've got a problem with the death of the weak and the vulnerable and so forth.
Hey, can I just say too, Shane, that before we go to our next question, thanks for that first question. I mean, I know it came from a skeptic, and there was, a little tone of, irritant, there with, because we're black and white, no nuance or whatever. And I get that from that worldview perspective, and we'll tackle these questions. So, we don't just take questions from people that agree with us. I certainly have lived this for a long time on airplanes.
I appreciate that. I really do.
Well, we need to take these questions seriously. And that, by the way, again, that's why everyone should sign up for this short course, at least on the abortion issue, because we're not talking to people who don't have opinions. We're talking to people, again, this Notre Dame study that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks on Breakpoint and Breakpoint podcast, basically says most people don't like abortion, but they don't want to change the laws. Well, we've got to look at this hard, not kind of what we want, but what is actually reasonable and true. And so I hope you heard first of all, that neither one of us answered this question with a Bible verse. We referred to some theology and trying to talk about some things, but by and large, we answered it because of what's publicly reasonable. And the life position, I think, historically will go down like the or the abolitionist position as the one that just most dignifies human life and the one that makes the most sense for a civilized people. And so on. So anyway, on to the next question.
Well, congratulations on meeting your quota for the number of times pitching the short course, John. That was very good. I think you probably hit about 9 times.
I'm super excited about this one.
Me too.
We called an audible, which we do a lot at the Colson Center, but we called an audible because going into this election, it is extremely critical. And I'm not talking about even the presidential race, although again, elections matter, as we said before, but there's going to be state level ballot initiatives in dozens of states. We've got one in Colorado, and the ability to be able to articulate, this is why life is a core issue, not just one of the issues to stack alongside of the other ones, but a core issue is going to be huge.
Okay. So let's move on to our next question here. Would you say then that philosophies and political ideologies are equivalent to worldview, modernism, postmodernism, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, etc.? So I guess if I can paraphrase this very short question, this was asked in response to something during a short course. If I can paraphrase it, it would be that this person wants to know whether every ism is really its own worldview, or whether there are sort of fragments of worldviews floating around out there. And then the implicit question is, what exactly is a worldview and how do we define it?
Well, I think philosophies would be closer to being equivalent of worldview, but not every philosophical idea. So we often say ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. If we went further into kind of the story of ideas, we would also say ideas have families. In other words, you'll find a lot of isms that belong in a worldview, what we might call a worldview family. And, for example, although, relativism or, some of the stuff we've talked about in terms of critical theory really belong to the family of postmodernism. Now, might not be directly equivalent, but, relativism is a view of truth. Postmodernism is a view of reality. A view of reality is really what could be properly called worldview. I would say that's different than political ideology. Political ideologies flow from worldview. Now, let me just say this, though, carefully. Political ideologies are often totalized. Now, what that means is political ideologies are often made as a theory of everything. That actually is a deeper reflection of a worldview. So if you're talking about a political idea like socialism, socialism itself is a totalizing ideology. In other words, the entire story of the world should be able to be fit into this framework of understanding, the economic forces at work and the amount of resources and also it assumes the sort of creatures we are as human beings. I think that's actually what makes it a false worldview. So the political ideologies that are connected to that, whenever a political ideology becomes an explanatory system, when it becomes what we call a theory of everything, you'll see this in nerdy books like you and I read, a TOE, a theory of everything. That's when it's really going to become, lifted to the position of worldview.
The prime example of this, of course, is Marxism, because Karl Marx looks at all of the scope of human history and he says, well, everything that we see, whether it's, religions or political claims or economic circumstances or all the conflicts of man ultimately boil down to the haves and the have-nots. It boils down to
Right.
material causes. That was his dialectical materialism. So he took a political assertion or economic assertion, and then he totalized it and made that the explanation for everything, and said you can't even have a religion that speaks to man's deeper conditions because it's all an opiate. It's all a means of ignoring the real problems.
And Marx's explanation for why he was doing what he was doing is one way to distinguish between a philosophy and a worldview. Marx said, the philosophers are trying to explain the world. I'm trying to change it. And that is a fundamental distinction in terms of, a disconnected intellectual exercise of explanation versus actually trying to engage. I would say, though, too, that there is a lot of subconscious ways that political ideologies start reflecting one's deeper worldview in a totalizing way. For example, Marx thought about it. He wanted to do it. He literally said, through this political ideology, I'm going to explain human behavior and social behavior and where history is headed. So he gave you an origin, identity, meaning, morality, and destiny in an economic theory, right? In other words, that's that kind of superimposing this totalizing narrative. And of course, that's one of the big problems for Marx is, if you've never seen the movie, by the way, Enemy at the Gates, it's this cat and mouse game of two snipers during the Second World War, in German and Russian going back and forth. And there's this moment in which this Russian sniper, this leader, this communist apologist realizes what he did wrong, what he missed. And he said, communism promised a new man, but there will never be a new man. Communists didn't have really an explanation for love and passion. You can't explain all of the non-tangible aspects of human emotion that drive our relationships and our society through economic means. It's a phenomenal last line. In fact, if we can find the quote, Shane, we'll put it in the show
probably
notes.
A YouTube video, right?
Well, it is. It's a remarkable indictment. It's a remarkable indictment of communism in a movie line. But on the flip side, I think right now, for example, we've got plenty of people both on the right and the left side of the political aisle that are treating their own political views as explanations for everything.
Right.
This is one of the ways that our politics becomes susceptible to conspiracy theories.
Mm-hmm.
Why we're so quick to hit send or forward on something that might not be true, but that explains our view of morality, right? I mean, there's a real totalizing narrative that has taken hold in both conservative and liberal circles, that the other person is the singular reason of what's wrong with the world, and everything can be explained by what Donald Trump did wrong or Kamala Harris did wrong. So this is a mistake. This is what Chuck Colson warned about when he warned about ideology overtaking faith. And so it's not just Marx who does political ideology as worldview. It's a whole lot of everyday Christians who have lost sight of the ultimate story.
I love that you distinguished worldviews from philosophies, John, because that's an important move to make. It's legitimate to do political philosophy not on the level of worldview, and then people from different worldviews can kind of get together and debate the specifics of it. But as soon as a philosophy becomes totalizing or a party becomes totalizing, it does aspire to the level of a worldview. And there are broad worldview categories, things that actually try to answer the big questions like who is man, where do we come from, where are we going, what's the problem with the world, what's the solution, those kinds of questions. And all the big worldview families, there's probably about 5 of them, have the answers to those questions, or at least attempt an answer. But some ideologies that aspire to answer those questions, they do so by just dismissing them. And this is one of the key marks of see what I did there? M-A-R-K-S, not M-A-R.
Oh, gosh.
But yes, sorry about that. This is one of the key marks of an ideology that's aspiring to the level of a worldview, is that it'll just dismiss whole categories of reality. And so Marx did precisely this, where he said the spiritual dimension of human being is just an illusion. It's an opiate. Mm-hmm. It's a thing that we invent in order to lull. It's a thing that the bourgeoisie invented in order to lull the proletariat into sort of a stupor, and they sort of care about what does Orwell call it in Animal Farm? It's like Sugar Candy Mountain. They just care about Sugar Candy Mountain, the future heavenly bliss that they'll receive if they just are good and quiet and peaceable workers in this life. And that's all he saw it as. He didn't think these sorts of spiritual questions and claims even needed to be answered because he had already explained them away. I think materialism in general is very prone to that sort of explaining away or dismissal, where it cannot explain that aspect of reality in a satisfactory manner. And so materialists will just dismiss it and say, it's not real. You see this with consciousness and the Darwinian materialist response to the idea that we have a soul beyond the material brain. They'll just dismiss it and say those categories are illusory. They don't exist. Our consciousness is simply an emanation of accidental random chemical reactions in our skulls. But that's not a satisfactory explanation.
No, it's not. And these things will always fail what we call in our book the test of the real world. We have 4 tests for worldviews: test of the evidence, the outer world, the test of the inner world is their coherence, the test of logic, so on. But the test of the real world is, it looks great on paper. How does it play itself out? I lived in Jamaica for a year, and Jamaica's number one export was something called bauxite, which is used to make aluminum. And they, back in the 60s or something like that, traded a bunch of bauxite to Russians for cars called ladas, and then they put them to work as taxis. See, the Russian illusion was, look, if the communists, sorry, I'm talking about the Soviet Union, the illusion there was if everyone had exactly what they want according to their need, then they would work hard for the common good. The problem is if people know no matter how hard they work, they're going to get the same amount of stuff, how hard are they going to work? Right? I mean, you can deny that part of human nature. I can tell you how hard they're going to work. Not very hard. And I know that because I've ridden in a Lada, right? One of these, Jamaican taxis. You ever see those commercials?
They're still running. The original shipment from the Soviet Union is still running in Jamaica as taxis.
Oh, listen, I got to tell you, if you ever see those cartoons where the car goes around the corner and the whole car kind of goes out and then snaps back into place? Yeah. That literally happens with Ladas. It's not a cartoon.
Wow, spectacular. I need to visit Jamaica for a lot of reasons, but to see the Ladas.
The Ladas, yeah, it's like a tourist attraction now, I'm telling you. And listen, if you're on the normal taxi route, you can hop in there with about eight other people, no air conditioning, I mean, it's a memorable experience.
Well beyond capacity. Well, John, I think we can move on to our last question here. And I hope that was a satisfactory answer. I know we just touched on it, but there's a lot to go on there. But that's a great question. So thank you for that. We'll move on to the next one here. This is an interesting historical question. And this may be something that we'd want to consult a historian on because neither of us are really experts on that. But I think we can take a crack at it. Given that the Romans had slaves and that slavery entered the West in the 16th and 17th centuries, what went wrong in the Christian worldview to lead to that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of historical factors. Number one is we have to remember that Christianity wasn't in power when the Romans had slaves. When you look at the scriptural writings, Paul's talking to people that are in a position of cultural minority, not a position of cultural majority, just really across the board. The other thing I would say is that particularly in Paul's letter to Philemon, what he's doing there is absolutely revolutionary and unheard of in that period. In other words, talking about brotherhood between slave owner and slave, and also, of course, recognizing that there's a pretty radical difference between the slavery back then and the sort of chattel slavery that we saw in the 16th and 17th centuries. And by the way, that's an argument, if you ask me, against moral evolution. In other words, slavery got worse and worse and worse, and the expression that we had in the British context and in the American colonial context was a horrific level of slavery that, it's not like when, as technology and our ability to sail around the world and to do new things got better, that our treatment of other people got better. It's that it actually got worse, which is another important thing. But the book that I'll point you to that really walks through this whole process, and it doesn't justify at all the fact that Christians miss this. It just explains a little bit more about this history is Rodney Stark's book, For the Glory of God. And Rodney Stark kind of walks through this chapter. One of the things to realize is that literally no one had thought in the history of the world that slavery wasn't normal in any sort of context. Until a group of Christians started talking about it. And it dates what before the 16th century, where Christians first of all started to go, this shouldn't be done, this is not right, until it finally hits its pinnacle in 17th and 18th century Britain, and then causes what became a civil war in America and so on. In other words, there is the only source to ever introduce, we forget the power of normal in human history, right? Like, this is the way it's always been done. It is a pretty powerful impulse. And no one even imagined that slavery shouldn't be around until Christians imagined it, except for, as Stark points out, a Jewish sect, kind of an esoteric Essene sect somewhere in the 4th or 5th century. But of course, they had no cultural influence, no cultural power at all. They were in the wilderness, in the desert, like the rest of the Essenes. It was really Christians in power who stepped up and were able to say, look, this is normal. No one's ever questioned this before. No one's ever thought this was the way that it shouldn't be done before. And you kind of compare it to other things in human history. For example, when did written law, as opposed to just the king's decree or the emperor's decree or the Lord's decree, when did that really take root? I mean, listen, that was a long evolution as well, right? I mean, it's not like the first person who thought, that guy is just like me. He shouldn't just be able to say whatever he wants and everyone obeys him. I mean, people said that for centuries before written law became a thing, which we now have. And there's very few dictatorships, at least in that sense, left around the world, comparatively speaking. So it just takes a long time for these things to take root. And you're right, Christians should have done a lot better. The Christian worldview was not dominant throughout most of this period. It was this kind of, ongoing, evolutionary position. It took too long. One of the things was the Catholic idea of station, that everyone's in their own station and they should honor God in their own station, which the Protestant Reformation flipped on its head in some really innovative ways. So there's that at work. But it was just normal, and the power of normal should not be underestimated.
In his book Dominion, Tom Holland has this really interesting section where he talks about the British abolitionist movement, how it came about, and then how it was exported around the world. And he deals specifically with the relationship between the British colonists and companies and their Arab partners, their Muslim partners in the Middle East. And he talks about how the Protestant Christians in the British Empire were trying to export this abolitionist idea. They were trying to compel these Arab slave owners to give up their slaves. And he mentions that he basically summarizes it, says that to the Arabs, this was incomprehensible. They didn't understand why slavery was a problem, why the Christians had such a hang up about it. And this was specifically the Ottomans, and why they kept making this a condition for trading. And the reason is simple, because the Ottomans were on, and the Turks, the Arabs, all the trading partners were on the side of the majority historically,
right,
in terms of slavery. Like, the idea that slavery is even a problem is fairly unique to Christianity. I mean, there have been other.
Well, it is,
but yeah, the thing that ultimately did it in worldwide is Christianity. And I would add that that movement goes back very deep into Christian history. It goes back to the church fathers. You have people arguing against the idea of slavery there right from the beginning. So it's a conversation that's happened within Christianity, and it's in line with. I wrote a column about this, I think last year. It's in conversation with a trajectory that you see all throughout Scripture, where does the story of God's people open in the Bible? It opens with slavery and a quest for freedom. The trajectory is always from slavery to liberation to freedom, and you see that become universalized in terms of salvation throughout the New Testament. So that was the sustaining narrative for slaves in so many instances, especially in the African slave trade, where they gravitated toward Moses. And there's a reason there are so many blacks in history named Moses, because that was a figure of great importance and inspiration.
Right, and African American spiritual hymns, are singing about the Exodus, right? But I think we underestimate just how long it takes for sometimes these ideas to bear fruit. I mean, even the story of the Exodus, which was a freedom narrative, wasn't totalizing. It wasn't. I mean, it was dealing with the Israelites in Egypt. It doesn't really ever say slavery is wrong.
Right.
It actually says, that God was pulling out his people. It
Yeah.
took a universal idea like the image of God, and the image of God then had to play itself out. I mean, Shane, how many times in our own lives have we known something to be true, and then we have these blind spots, right? And how I treat this person, or how I forgive over here, or how I deal with my past over here, or how I confront this sin over here. And it takes decades for God to work that out of us. And that's just you and me, right? I think we underestimate the power of the blind spots. Now, it doesn't mean we're not morally guilty for being unforgiving or ungracious or, stuck in this sin over here. But maybe it can give a little bit more perspective why it takes so long sometimes for these ideas to bear fruit in culture, especially from a group of people who again, didn't have the power for a really long time. And then when it did, it took a really long time for it to work itself out.
Yeah, and I'm pretty proud as a Protestant what a key role the Protestant nation of England played in that particular abolitionist movement. Of course, that goes back to guys who just wouldn't shut up, like William Wilberforce, who believed staunchly in the equality of all men, and that slavery, as it was practiced in the British Empire, was a wicked institution.
Well, I'll leave for a second whether Anglicans or Protestants or third way. But anyway, we'll keep going.
Anglicans are definitely Protestants, John. Come on.
There is a difference between the Continental Reformation and the rest, but we're into nerdy territory here that is going to be interesting for some of us. Maybe we can, we'll have to get a guest, another expert on to talk about that.
We'll have to do that. That would be great. Well, we're out of time for today, folks. Thanks so much for listening to the Breakpoint podcast and our Q&A session. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. So drop us a message on social media or email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org, and we'd love to engage with it. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.